Peter Thiel, who's kind of, helping host this event, did a really interesting talk on the Antichrist.
So he's been focusing on the Antichrist, and he's been talking about it as, in history, how has the Antichrist been represented? When we think about the Antichrist, how best to conceal being Antichrist? Well, that is to talk about it a lot, and basically to, push this idea that there's an apocalypse, okay, and that we are, we need to save ourselves and do good, okay, and of course everybody's going to agree with that, and that's a great veneer. And then he reminded the audience that that's of course how the Antichrist presents, as the one that is, giving the solution. And so I thought that was really interesting. What did you think about that?
I thought so too. He cites Thessalonians, peace and safety being the slogan of the Antichrist. I think you look at a lot of evil that's done in today's world, without getting too specific, depending on which side of the aisle you're on, but it's on both sides. And I think you have a lot of today's evil is couched in this veneer of kind of utilitarian, effective altruism. World is my sandbox. I'm going to, rearrange the figures, on a global scale and like make things sort of work out. And that is sort of a form of evil.
It's also outward looking. So it's never inward looking. Like, am I doing bad or am I harming people?
And you met Rene Girard.
Yeah. I love his theories. I'm a Girardian too.
And Girard always says, to even spot a scapegoat, you need a third party witness, because nobody thinks that they're doing the scapegoating. And in fact, we're doing scapegoating all day long. And the history of humanity is the history of human violence, and that all of us have sort of, greedy impulses. And there's obviously violence up until, murder and large scale war and stuff. But we do small violence to one another all the time through mimetic desires and jealousy and that sort of thing. And we have to look inward.
Yeah, that's right. So his professor was Rene Girard, and I was at Berkeley at the time, at the Jesuit School of Theology, and Peter was at Stanford. And so while he was taking these classes, I was actually driving to Rene Girard's colloquiums to listen to him. And so I had been exposed to his theories when I was an undergraduate at the University of California in Davis. And his book, Violence in the Sacred, kind of broke through and really destabilized a lot of different disciplines. And a lot of people didn't like it because it was such a giant theory of everything, right? It was really a theory of everything, like a theory of evil, right? And Rene Girard was a Catholic, right? And he would attend, I believe it was Latin Mass. And so the Jesuits that I was taking courses from, they didn't want to go themselves because there was something kind of heretical about Rene Girard, because there was they said that there wasn't anything really transcendent about Christ for Rene Girard, that he looked at evil as like an anthropology, like, that we were, there was no transcendent or metaphysical evil that he spoke of.
I think what's so heretical about Girard and why he was so sort of not accepted both by religious scholars or by, evolutionary biologists in his time, is because he has this sort of theory of everything, this kind of proto-architecture, like to religion. And so that's like real heresy.
Yes, it absolutely is.
Right?
Yeah.
And we talked about that earlier in the context of Plato, maybe another person who has this kind of proto-architecture of religion. So we were talking, off camera before this. You were saying, you interpret Plato maybe slightly differently than a lot of kind of quote unquote philosophers or scholars.
That's right. Yeah. So of course I read Plato, early on as an undergraduate and again as a graduate student, but I really didn't start actually reading Plato until I encountered the people who believed in UFOs, and I saw the ways in which UFOs have been, concealed by our government. Within this environment where I witnessed harassment firsthand, saw people who were the quote unquote whistleblowers being harassed. And, it's not pretty. It's terrible. And I was depressed. So I thought, how do I make sense of this? And so Plato's Republic kept coming back into my head. And Plato, by the way, he asked the question, can there be a just society? And why he asks this is because he's pretty horrified by what happened to his mentor. His mentor was killed by his government, which was Athens. And Socrates was given an out, but he didn't take it. Instead, he said, I live by the laws of Athens and I'll die by them. And this is just, this is right. Well, Plato didn't buy that, it seems. He has a dialogue between Socrates and Glaucon, and they ask the question, can we have a just government? And they go through all these ridiculous scenarios. He's saying that, no, it doesn't look like we can figure out how to have a just government. How do we do it? Well, then he performs it. He does a performative thing at the end of the Republic. And so what does he give us? He gives us two things that we call allegories or metaphors. One is the allegory of the cave. People are, see shadows on the wall, and they think that and people are showing them these shadows, by the way. So we tend to discount that there are other people that are or things that are showing us these shadows, and we are thinking that they're reality. And somehow we get out and we ascend out of the cave and we recognize that, wow, most people are completely blinded by this. Okay. So how does this work then? And so then he throws in basically the first recorded, or one of the first recorded NDEs, which is the myth of which is about the soldier who dies in battle and has a near-death experience and sees that people actually, live again. They're immortal. They have some kind of soul. And so he tells this story. Well, those are two very strange ways to end this book about the just society. And so when I'd ask my professors, what does this mean? Because I went back to them, and I even asked my friends who are philosophers, so what do you think about this? It's just a metaphor. It's just an allegory. Well, I don't think it is. So what's then the takeaway? The takeaway is a performative thing. It's nothing that you can say, Jesse, do this and it'll be all right. No, you have to actually do it. What is it? Well, it's basically creating a community of people like the other person. So it's called the dialectic, and it's a mystical conversation, basically, which is really hard for us to wrap our brains around. What does it even mean to have a mystical conversation? I think that if people are watching this talk, they've had a mystical conversation, right? And you have too. Think of those times when you met that person who's like your best friend, and every time you saw them, the energy would change, and you'd have such an amazing talk. That's what he's talking about. That kind of community based on that. Because wouldn't you die for that person? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you do those things that are noble before that friendship?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the kind of thing that he's giving us.
That's amazing. Well, yeah. And I think a lot of Plato readers think of him as fully allegorical, and they don't think there's some metaphysical architecture that he's actually talking about. Like the myth of I think, is a great example. So the cave is another example. But in the case of the myth of he's talking about this myth where you have anamnesis. You have this idea that there's this primordial soul self that kind of has knowledge of all of your incarnations. And then you cross the river of forgetfulness into, an incarnation where you forget your former self. And maybe through kind of a near-death experience or a mystery ritual, which, by the way, Plato, we probably now know, went through the Eleusinian mystery rituals himself.
That's right.
And so he probably believed this, to all the people that think it's just an allegory. Then you experience noesis. You yes. regain knowledge of your kind of immortal soul. Do you think that literal reading of Plato is an important kind of overlay that is missing in today's reading?
I think that I went through graduate school, and of course, any kind of literalist reading of any of these texts is abhorred. So people are going to say, no, you can't read it literally like that. And I know, okay. So yeah, did he really mean it this way? Well, not necessarily literally, there's a cave, but he meant it in a very real sense. And that's what I'm trying to get at here. And yes, there's, this goes against the grain of both liberal and conservative readings of Plato, right? It's a completely mystical reading here. It goes beyond even, some people read it as this is the subjectivity of, human subjectivity. It goes beyond that because it poses something other than the human itself or himself or herself.